all, and welcome back to another episode of the ICIS Energy Foresight podcast. Today we're going to talk about power demand, and with me here I have Matthew Jones and Luca Urbanucci that will let me understand what's going on in Europe on power demand and what's the future outlook. Hi guys.
Hey Matteo.
Hi Matteo, nice to see you.
Thank you. So I think that the first question that is the question everybody's trying to answer is, which was actually also the question that we tried to answer in our webinar: when will demand materialize? Matt, last year demand dropped by 3.2% compared to the previous year, and if we compare that to the 5-year average, we are below roughly 6.5%. What is happening this year, and are we could keep seeing the same trend, or are we seeing signs of a recovery at European level?
Yeah, I think that the headline answer to that is that this year should finally be the year of some demand recovery after the 2 years of falling consumption that we've seen within Europe. And I think the reasons for that are partly the decline in wholesale prices that we've seen and continue to see. We expect prices at the moment to be around 40% lower than last year, and that filters through to residential consumer and industrial consumer prices, albeit that they won't decline by as much as the wholesale price. Then you've got falling inflation rates. So the ECB forecasting 2.3% drop in the Eurozone this year, down from over 5 last year, over 8 the year before that. And if you combine that with GDP growth, that means you get a rise in real wages and consumers effectively having more money. And then thirdly, interest rates should also begin to fall as the inflation drops. So I think it's important to note that it should be a gradual process, right? There's still major problems in certain sectors, including subsectors of industry. And even though prices are falling, they're still a long way above pre-crisis levels. So kind of a new normal that consumers are going to have to get used to in terms of prices. And that means that some behavior changes are likely to prove quite sticky. But in total, what we're expecting is demand to increase by 2.9% this year, and then by 2.7% next year. So demand this year remaining slightly below 2022 values. But the recovery, we think, has started or will start this year.
Thanks, Matt. I think that there is a lot to unpack there. And I think those dynamics are somehow having an impact across the different sectors. And probably it's the impact that we are seeing and that will likely unfold over the next months is different. Luca, can you help us understand and start digging a little bit more into one of the main sectors which was probably affected by that, industries? And are we seeing continuation of that demand destruction, or there is something that is starting to happen there?
Yes, sure. We estimate that at European level, industrial demand fell by almost 4% in 2023, following what happened in 2022 when industrial demand also dropped by around 3% year on year. And this means that last year, the industrial sector was responsible for about 40% of the overall decline in electricity demand. And as Matt mentioned, the main reason of this fall is quite straightforward, and is prices. Indeed, in the last 2 years, industrial prices of electricity have been consistently at least 50% higher than the average of the 4 previous years. And as a result, several plants were forced to shut down because there was no longer economic sustainability. And of course, some sectors were hit harder than others. In terms of industrial output, the aluminium, the chemicals, and the iron and steel sectors recorded the strongest reduction, while on the other hand, the food and beverage sector held up quite well, and the transport sector was one of the few growing exceptions. And maybe it's worth spending a couple of words on the chemical sector, as it is the largest industrial sector in terms of electricity consumption. It accounts for around 18% of the total industrial demand. And it also helps answering the second part of your question on demand destruction. So the chemical sector has been impacted by decreasing global demand growth expectations, partly due to COVID, combined with new global capacity coming online from projects started before the pandemic. So, as a result, European producers are now facing a situation of global overcapacity and increasing competition at the same time due to high energy costs. So, looking ahead, the outlook for European chemicals is quite poor, as more global capacity is expected to be built outside Europe, especially in China, the Middle East, and the US. So, overall, on the chemical side, there is no real signs of recovery at the moment, but things look slightly better in other sectors. For example, moderate rebound is expected in the next couple of years in the steel sector, which accounts for 11% of the European industrial demand, as steel consumption is expected to grow by an average 4% in 2024 and 2025.
Thanks a lot, Luca. I think it's super fascinating because by looking at consumption patterns, we are actually seeing what is unfolding in terms of the restructuring of the European industrial sector as a whole, with, let's say, a lot of ongoing dynamics that will probably reshape the future of the whole sector. Matt, a question for you. And this might be a little bit controversial, Matt, so try to be slightly provocative. So the energy transition is a story of the electrification of consumption. But yet, what we are seeing is that power demand is struggling to pick up. At the same time, it's interesting because last year we saw very big numbers in terms of electric vehicles sold across different European markets, and also was quite good and healthy on the heat pump side. So how do we see that playing forward? What is the impact that we expect from these new sources of power demand on the overall demand?
Yeah, good question. I think electrification is going to be playing an important role in the years ahead. Main categories, as you point out, heat pumps, electric vehicles. Also worth talking about hydrogen produced via electrolyzers, which by the end of the decade should also start to play a role in increasing European power demand. I think we kind of have to divide up the time zones a bit. So in the next 2 years, I think it's really a story of demand recovery in those traditional sectors, residential, commercial, industry, that have been hit so hard over the past couple of years. So in the next 2 years, we think of the demand increase, electrification should account for around 20%. But if you then look at the second half of the decade, it's a very different story. So when you get past 2025, the vast majority of your year-on-year increase in power demand is coming from electrification with those heat pumps, electric vehicles, and the electrolyzers. And so they just become a more and more important part of the story. We see EV fleet increasing by a factor of 5 between 2023 and 2030. We see heat pumps tripling from around 20 to 60 million by 2030. And then we'll have several gigawatts of electrolyzers that start to play a role when we get into the back end of the decade. So, they're not playing a huge role now. It's really the focus is on how quickly does demand recover in those traditional sectors. But by the time we get into the second half of the decade, they are the reason why demand should increase year on year.
That's super interesting. And I guess if I can sum it up is next 2 years, more of the same in terms of, consumption patterns with a recovery, but profiles should be kind of the same. But as we move into the second half of this decade, we will start seeing more demand coming from other sectors, which will probably have an impact on also the profiling of that demand. And obviously there's another element which we haven't touched upon, which is how, demand can actually become part of the supply with the demand response and anything related to that. But that's another story, one for another day. Thanks again, guys, for this very interesting and insightful conversation. And as always, if you want to know more about Energy Foresight, please go on our website or reach out directly. Thanks again, and to the next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.